Going back to the issue of polygamy, ideologically, I agree with you as far as your arguments. The exact same ones that you use for gay marriage can also apply to polygamous marriage. But empirically, that doesn't seem to be the case ever as far as the statement that it does no harm. In fact, there are plenty of examples where polygamous marriage does harm to the people involved, especially the women and the children. And not only that, I think it also does economic harm to the rest of society, who a lot of times ends up supporting those large families that cannot subsist on one person's salary. How would you address that?
Well, I don't want to get into too much of the specifics of that case. That is, insofar as, yes, there are definitely some differences there. But one thing I would say is, well, if it caused economic harm, that is not a reason to diminish a right. If something is economically inconvenient to the society, that is, we pay a great deal as it is to protect rights. And I would say we would simply be paying some more of that same coin to protect those rights. So because something may be economically or logistically inconvenient to a society is not a justification for reducing a right. I have heard arguments against polygamy that claim that it causes harm, and these would not be parallel arguments to same-sex marriage. That is, it says, for example, that, well, one argument I've heard, interestingly enough, is that polygamy, for example, when you're talking about multiple wives, is that then some men won't have partners. That some men will have too many partners, and other men won't have any. And so it's morally wrong because of that. Well, as I say, I think that actually where those arguments come in, it would be disanalogous to this case. I think so, in terms of the harm. I don't see that the harm that could result from same-sex marriage being on a level as the harm that could result from polygamous marriage, at least as you're describing. That is the economic harm of the additional family and things like that. So I would say not, for our purposes, not necessarily analogous.
I found it interesting that you were saying that civil liberties should be protected despite the will of the majority. And yet, in states like California and Maine, recently we're seeing votes of the majority overturning the courts where they have protected constitutional rights to same-sex marriage.
Well, we don't exactly have an explicit constitutional right to it yet. And this is part of the problem. It may have to be resolved at the constitutional level. In order for states not to discriminate like that, it may have to be a constitutional amendment that ensures, because federal law always trumps state law, that would ensure that those rights are not, for example, voted away by some referendum in some state. Just let's imagine a state that said, for example, that being Islamic was against the law. And the majority of people decided in that state, yeah, we don't want any Muslims, we are going to outlaw Muslims. Well, they wouldn't have any right to do so. They wouldn't have any legal standing by which to do so, even if the entire population of that state was in agreement. Because again, the rights of minorities do not depend upon the will of the majority. And these kind of things need to be hammered out, it seems to me, in the courts and in the legislature. And it will probably take nothing short of a constitutional redress of this matter. I would add, though, that the right to same-sex marriage, in my analysis, is already there in the constitutional framework of civil liberties and protections. It does not take a great stretch to read that all persons are already protected, enjoy equal protection under the law without regard to sex or sexual orientation. And so if that's the case, then you could say the protections are already there, we just need to enforce them, something like that. I don't know if that helps. Well, a few more, huh?
She's got another one here.
Do we have a historical model of a civilization that viewed sexuality as morally ambiguous and accepted? I mean, it seems that the religious right keeps pointing to their historical models of what a marriage should be. Is there something that we could rebut that and say, well, you know, there is this civilization that accepted this and it seemed to work just fine.
Even if there were, I don't think that that would be relevant in this argument. That is, I don't think that that would decide this argument. If I could show a successful society, I'm thinking possibly of ancient Athens, something like that. If I could show a successful society in which same-sex relationships were accepted and tolerated, that wouldn't therefore justify it, any more than even if I couldn't point to a single example, that would then therefore refute it. What we are talking about is going forward. As I said, appealing to the past, even if we can't find any support in the past, that doesn't mean that we're not going in the right direction. The past has been discriminatory and unjust, at least in my analysis.
You've got me thinking in very complicated ways about the relationship between religious and secular morality. And I'm really wondering, a lot of the moral precepts that you've identified as secular seem to have historically religious roots. They seem to derive from religious doctrine of various kinds. Has religion appropriated fundamentally human moral precepts, or is secular society trying to appropriate and cleanse of their religious origins religious moral precepts?
I think I would rather say the latter. I would sooner say the latter. I would say that religion can certainly hit upon appropriate moral principles, but the justification for those principles is not that religion has supported them. The justification for those principles would be on their own terms, that they yield moral results. And so, yes, I think what has happened is that principles which may originally have been originating from religion have been adopted, not to say appropriated, as secular moral principles. For example, the idea of equality, which is a relatively recent notion in human history. So, I mean, back to Molly, to your question about, in the past, can we think of a society in which everyone was equal in the past? I mean, of different classes, different races, religions, sexual orientations. I can't think of a one, actually. So I would want to say, even if, in fact, we got these things from religion, like the idea of equality, it isn't because religion said so that makes it right. I think the idea of equality originated in the idea that we were all equal before God. That is, but we can take away the idea of God and still keep the idea that, yes, we are all fundamentally equal. In the eyes of what? Well, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of society, in the eyes of one another. Something along those lines. So removing the unnecessary support of religion is actually part of the purification process whereby morality can stand on its own 2 feet. It's not to say that if religion says we should do it, it's wrong. Certainly, we should do plenty of the things that the religions tell us to do, and we should not do the things that they tell us not to do. But, and here I'm paraphrasing Nietzsche, one of my favorites, he says, the reason why you ought to do it or not to do it is different than what you thought it was. It's not because the Bible said so or not. It's because it's good to do it, or bad. Not bad to do it, so don't. Good to do it, so do. Not because religion